Welcome to episode 111 of the Scarlet Faithful podcast. I'm Aaron Breitman coming to you on Friday, July 14th. Happy Friday. Wanted to do kind of a fun episode, I think. Going into the weekend on Thursday, I tweeted, who do Rutgers fans feel are the most underappreciated players of all time in any sport? So I got a ton of responses. I got almost 100 responses. It's still going, actually, but it's slowed down. So I got so many with football that I'm going to dedicate this episode specifically to underappreciated Rutgers football players. And then next week I'll cover basketball, and then probably maybe do another one with non-football, non-basketball, because I did get a good amount: baseball, lacrosse, soccer, which is pretty cool. So hope you have fun with this. Football, I had 36 former players mentioned at least once, 7 of which were mentioned multiple times. So first off, let me just quickly run down the players that were mentioned as underappreciated by the fans. Again, undervalued players that had a huge impact that probably aren't talked about enough nowadays. And, it's obviously subjective. So I'm sure I'm not going to mention certain players that others, hopefully watching and listening to this, will think are underappreciated, should have been mentioned. I'm going to throw in some players at the end that personally I think that were not mentioned. And yes, there's a little bit of it doesn't go too far past the 80s and into the 70s. So if anyone is upset about that, I apologize, but follow me on Twitter, because I'm going to be doing this a lot, and you can respond to me there. So let's start with players that were mentioned once. This is a particular era for me that I'm very fond of in the early 90s. Sean Seabrooks, Reggie Thunderbrook, Bruce Presley, Terrell Willis, Thunder and Lightning, if you know, Chris Brantley, Malik Jackson, Jay Bellamy, and Rashad Swinger. So that someone tweeted all of those at once. That is a very specific time period for Rutgers football, a fun period for Rutgers football that I would say is underappreciated as an era. Okay, Ches Moses, Janarian Grant, Jawan Jameson, J.J. Jennings, great running back, one of the best ever. Scott Ernie, Eric Foster, Jim and Bob Dumont, brothers, played in the 70s. Joe Martinek, Pedro Sosa, and the entire 2006 offensive line. I like that one. Adam Korsak. It was more of, how's he going to end up? I don't think he'll be underappreciated, but we'll see. I had to mention it. Fair. John Sismus, receiver. Courtney Green, Josh Hicks, Leonte Carew. Leonte Carew is, he had an unbelievable career. He was arguably the best receiver in Rutgers history. I don't know if he's underappreciated, but listen, it's subjective, and I appreciate everyone's opinions and respect it. Gary Brackett, Caleb Johnson, Nate Leonard, Ray Rice, Anthony Davis. Ray Rice is another one. I don't think he's underappreciated. I think if you feel like he's not being mentioned enough, unfortunately, it has to do with what happened to him off the field. But as a player, anyone that was, present then, knows how critical he was to the success of everything. San Sante, you gotta love that. So that's all the different players that were mentioned once. Now the 7 players that were mentioned twice. Multiple times. Some were mentioned twice. Some were mentioned more. We have 3 quarterbacks, 2 running backs, and 2 defensive players. On the defensive side, Ramil Meekins. I love this one. Love Ramil Meekins, critical player for the rise of the Shiano era. Kasim Green. Kasim Green was, Big East Defensive Player of the Year. I think he's, I guess, you could argue that he's not talked about enough. But those are the 2 defensive players mentioned. And then, let's see, running back, Robert Martin, I thought was interesting. He was very good. And then Paul James, which I really love. This one, injuries took a toll on him, but he had some explosive games, and he was a weapon, and he was just fun to watch, and definitely deserves appreciation. So then leaves us the 3 quarterbacks. Kind of funny that, quarterback would be underappreciated, under the microscope the most. But the three quarterbacks mentioned, Mike McMahon. We're going back to my time as a student. I had a class with Mike McMahon. I've written about Mike McMahon that I feel like he is the most underappreciated quarterback, just in terms of his talent. He was a pro. He was an NFL quarterback. He was on some really, really terrible teams. When I was at Rutgers, won 8 games total over 4 years. My senior year, they beat Syracuse, their only win. He got beat up. It's a miracle he even made the pros, just that he was healthy enough to get there. But he was an elite athlete, and I don't think enough fans know or remember or appreciate how good he was. The other two, Mike Teal, arguably the best quarterback in Rutgers history, and Gary Nova. So Teal is interesting. I think that if you look statistically, and I could have made a whole documentary out of all this. I could have done a week long. I could have done research upon research. Looking at the record books, you look where everyone ends up. That could help form an argument as well. But Teal, owns the records in a lot of things in terms of passing, and I think that his career trajectory was so interesting because he started as a game manager and then was a prolific passer at the end of his career. So he finished with the most yards thrown in program history, beating Gary Nova by just over 100 yards, 9,383. Gary Nova's number 2. Then you have attempts. Nova's number 1. Teal was 3. Completions, Nova 2, Teal 3. Touchdowns, Nova 1, Teal 2. So Gary Nova threw for 9,258 yards and a program record 73 touchdowns. No one's even close. Teal threw for 59. Nova had an interesting career in that it was up and down. He had some really bad games at time, even his senior year, which was a tremendous year under Ralph Friedgen as offensive coordinator. We all remember the Penn State game. Might have forgotten the Kent State game in 2012, the Louisville game, the bowl game against Virginia Tech. He had some really tough games, but he had some amazing games too. And that senior year, he finished 3rd in the Big Ten in passer rating or quarterback rating. Think about that. That's amazing. And I think that part of Nova's legacy now is that Rutgers has not come close to having a quarterback at the level and quality of Nova. Jersey guy, definitely is underappreciated. And Teal, I think argue too. I when I had Mike on the podcast to preview the team last year, and I called him the greatest quarterback in Rutgers history. I angered some old timers, and I kind of think that that's partly an argument of he is underappreciated. I think what he did in his career and what he meant to that time period for Rutgers, and again his evolution as a quarterback, I think he is underappreciated as well. But Gary Nova won in a landslide in terms of votes. He had 11 mentions, the only Rutgers player to get double digits. Teal had 5, and then everyone else had 2 or 3 or 1. So I thought that was really interesting. I have some players that I'd like to mention that were not mentioned. For me, first off, Tim Brown. Tremendous receiver, spark plug, big. When you think of a big play receiver, first of all, you don't think of Tim Brown in terms of under 6 feet. That kind of he doesn't have the makeup or the prototypical big play receiver. But boy, could he make big plays. Of course, the game-winning, I forget how many yards. It was over 50 yards. Game-winning touchdown at UConn. One of the most dramatic moments in Rutgers history. The Texas Bowl. I don't know if people realize that he finished second. Oh, he's tied with Brandon Coleman for 20 touchdowns, second most in program history. Number one, of course, is Leonte Carew, which, when someone said he was underappreciated, I kind of laughed at that. Because again, he was so appreciated, I think, at his time. I feel like Carew, to me, like, we knew what we had when we had him. We knew he was special. I think maybe Tim Brown, when we had him, uh, you didn't necessarily know that. And he wasn't a great receiver at first. His senior year, he had over 1,000 yards. He really broke out, over 50 catches. But his body of work, even the years he only had 25, catches, he scored big plays. He had big touchdowns. He was a weapon that I don't know if Rutgers has really had since. Yes, Carew was a huge deep threat. You had, but they were all different skill sets, right? And Tim Brown, being as small as he was and be able to make the plays he did, I just think he stands out. Other guys that I think should have been mentioned: Jamal Westerman, Ryan Neal, Raheem Orr. Neal and Orr were, early Shiano era defensive players that I remember fondly. I actually have a Raheem Orr jersey, and was the only one they sold at the time, number one. And but Jamal Westerman, obviously he had a huge impact. He's, in the record books. Nate Torrin is one that, obviously people that remember the 1976 team in that era are going to say, oh, he's not underappreciated. But I don't think enough people know who he is. Talking about quarterbacks, how about Ryan Hart? Not one mention. And I don't think, and I've had him on the pod before. He talked about, losing his job to Teal and then winning it back and how he handled that whole thing. But, he was a prolific passer as well. He's the all-time program leader in, sorry, I knocked it down. It's not passing yards, but it's completions, right? I think I got that right. Ryan Hart, yes, most completions in program history. He is third in yards behind Nova and Teal, and he's second in attempts. He's first in completions, and he's third in touchdowns. And I don't think Ryan Hart gets enough credit. And he really, he started the upswing under center. And again, Teal comes in, and I think that, looking back on it, that had to be a really tough situation. He talked about it on the podcast. If you look up Scarlet Faithful, I think he was episode single digits. He was like 7 or 8. He was a great guest. But he's on my list. And who else do I have? Recent one that I think people that you have to give. I know people don't like to give Chris Ash credit, but Gus Edwards was a tremendous add to the transfer portal, and is still going strong with the Baltimore Ravens. I've actually been working on a little bit of an article for him, because Ravens fans have been saying how, underappreciated they think he is. He's been very consistent for the Baltimore Ravens, but he was very good for Rutgers and was a great kind of surprise addition, and had a really strong year for Rutgers. So I mentioned him. And then some guys, back in the mid 2000s that I think are underappreciated, or, actually not going back that far, in terms of, various years there, but Kevin Snyder, Scott Vallone, and Marcus Thompson, all guys to me that had really good careers for Rutgers. And, I know that, underappreciated is a very arbitrary subjective term in terms of people that maybe it's all based on your perspective, right? In terms of when those guys played and how how much experience you have with the program. But to me, those guys definitely were underappreciated. The 2012 defense. So did I mention? Oh, Tyrone Stowe, who is the program leader in assisted tackles. Nate Torrens, number one in sacks, 3 years in a row. Stowe, number two in tackles. Brian Sheridan's another one in the mid 90s, leads the program in tackles. I don't know how many people talk about him enough. Just kind of looking at everything to make sure I didn't miss anyone that I wanted to mention. But yeah, I appreciate everyone that answered. I hope this was fun. I could have gone in. I could have made this an hour, but I wanted to get through this part of it, and kind of touch on a lot of different players that all deserve mention. And to me, this was a great exercise because there were so many Rutgers fans that participated and also brought so many different perspectives and so many different players up from over the years. And listen, Rutgers football has a deep history. Obviously, birthplace of college football, but people like to undermine Rutgers fans on social media because the football team hasn't been good in a while. But we know, and I appreciate everyone that wrote in. Gary Nova, anointed the most underappreciated player in Rutgers history. It'll be interesting to see how that continues. Um, but obviously, what he meant to that 2014 season, Rutgers doesn't have a winning season and win 8 games in their first year in the Big Ten without Gary Nova and the progression that he made. So thank you for listening and watching once again. Have a great weekend, and I'll be back on Monday, barring any breaking news over the weekend.